The morning sun cast long shadows across Margaret Chen's kitchen counter as she stared at her phone, waiting for a reply that wouldn't come. The text she'd sent 3 hours ago still showed as delivered but unread. "Hi honey, just wanted to see how your presentation went yesterday. Love you." Below it, a string of other unanswered messages stretched back over the past 2 weeks, cheerful check-ins that had been met with silence or, worse, the dreaded 3-word responses that felt more dismissive than no response at all. At 52, Margaret had perfected the art of making herself small. She moved through her suburban Denver home like a ghost, straightening cushions that were already straight, watering plants that didn't need water, and checking her phone every few minutes for messages from David, her 28-year-old son who lived just 40 minutes away but felt worlds apart. The distance between them wasn't measured in miles, it was measured in missed calls, postponed visits, and the growing sense that she'd become an obligation rather than a relationship. The kitchen smelled faintly of the vanilla candles she'd taken to burning during the day, anything to make the house feel less empty, less like a museum of a life that had moved on without her. Through the window, she could see the Hendersons next door loading their car for another weekend adventure. Their teenage daughter rolling her eyes at something her father said but still laughing, still engaged, still present in their family dynamic. Margaret envied that easy connection, the way some families seemed to navigate the transition from child rearing to adult relationships without losing each other entirely. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 28 years being everything to David's soccer mom, homework helper, college fund builder, career counselor, emotional support system. Now that he was a successful marketing executive with his own apartment, his own life, his own priorities, she'd somehow become optional. Not just optional and visible, Margaret's reflection caught her eye in the kitchen window. Asian American features that still held traces of the beauty that had once turned heads, now softened by years of putting everyone else first. Her black hair streaked with premature silver that had appeared seemingly overnight during David's senior year of college, was pulled back in the same practical ponytail she'd worn for the past 5 years. When had she stopped trying? When had she accepted that her best years were behind her? When had she begun to see herself through David's eyes as someone whose primary value lay in her availability rather than her capabilities? The house felt suffocating in its silence. David's childhood bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it for college basketball. Trophies gathering dust on shelves she'd dusted obsessively for 4 years after his departure. Graduation photos yellowing on the walls despite her efforts to preserve them. A twin bed that looked absurdly small now that she imagined her adult son's frame folded into it. She'd kept it as a shrine to their relationship, a physical manifestation of her hope that he'd return not just for visits, but for the kind of deep, meaningful connection they'd shared when he was young. But he hadn't slept in that bed in over 3 years, and the room had become less of a welcome space and more of a monument to her inability to accept change. Her phone buzzed. Her heart leaped until she saw it was just a promotional text from the grocery store. The disappointment hit harder than it should have. This was her life now, jumping at every notification, hoping it was her son reaching out, only to be reminded that she'd become background noise in his success story. Margaret walked to her home office, really just a converted spare bedroom where she managed her freelance bookkeeping clients. The work paid the bills and kept her mind occupied, but it didn't fill the growing void in her chest. Spreadsheets and tax forms had become her primary companions, numbers that balanced perfectly, but somehow left her feeling more unbalanced than ever. She'd built her entire identity around being David's mother, and now that he didn't need her, who was she supposed to be? The question haunted her during the long afternoons when her clients' financial records were organized and there was nothing left to do but wait for 5 o'clock to arrive so she could justify starting dinner, even though she'd been eating alone most nights for the past year. The computer screen displayed her latest client's spreadsheet, rows and columns of numbers. That represented someone else's dreams and ambitions. A small bakery owner's monthly expenses carefully categorized and analyzed. Margaret found herself wondering about the woman behind those numbers. Whether she felt fulfilled kneading dough at 4 a.m, whether she'd built something that would outlast her, whether she went home each night feeling like she'd contributed something meaningful to the world. Margaret's contribution felt increasingly abstract, keeping other people's financial records in order, while her own life remained carefully balanced but utterly predictable. A memory surfaced unbidden. David at 8 years old, running into the kitchen with paint-stained fingers and wild eyes, his school clothes splattered with every color in the art supply closet. Mom, I painted the most amazing picture. Want to see?" He'd been so eager to share everything with her, then every scraped knee that needed kissing, every friendship drama that required maternal wisdom, every small victory that deserved celebration. She'd been his first call for everything, His primary audience, the person whose approval mattered most in his expanding world. When had that changed? When had she become an afterthought in the life she'd spent decades nurturing? Actually, she knew exactly when. It started in high school when he began rolling his eyes at her questions about his day, treating her maternal interest as intrusion rather than affection. Accelerated in college when her calls became interruptions to his social life, poorly timed reminders of obligations he was trying to outgrow. And crystallized 3 months ago, when he'd snapped at her for hovering after she'd offered to help him move furniture into his new apartment. A gesture she'd meant as love, but he'd received as judgment. "I'm not a kid anymore, Mom. I can handle things myself. You don't need to fix everything for me." The words had hit like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She had been trying to fix things to stay relevant, to maintain their connection through acts of service because she didn't know how else to relate to the successful man her little boy had become. Somewhere in the transition from childhood to adulthood, they'd lost the language of easy intimacy, and she'd been desperately trying to rebuild it using tools that no longer worked. Margaret closed the laptop and walked to the living room, where framed photos chronicled David's life from chubby-cheeked toddler to capanned gown graduate. In every picture, she stood beside him, beaming with pride, living vicariously through his achievements. There she was at his elementary school science fair, his middle school basketball games, his high school graduation, his college commencement, a visual timeline of unwavering support and boundless maternal love. But what had she achieved? What did she have to show for 52 years of life, beyond being someone's mother? The realization was both devastating and liberating. She'd been so focused on helping David become someone that she'd forgotten to become someone herself. The photos told another story too, one she'd never noticed before. In the early pictures, she looked vibrant, engaged, purposeful. Her smile was genuine, her posture confident, her eyes bright with the energy of someone fully invested in the present moment. But as the years progressed, something subtle changed. Her smiles became more strained, her posture more self-effacing, her entire presence more apologetic. She'd literally watched herself disappear, frame by frame, year by year, until she became a supporting character in her own life story. The afternoon stretched ahead like all the others, empty and echoing with the weight of unfulfilled potential. She could clean the already clean house, work on another client's books, maybe call her sister in California who would listen politely while Margaret tried not to sound desperate for connection. She could reorganize David's childhood bedroom for the 20th time or start another craft project that would sit half-finished in the closet with all the others. The routine felt like quicksand, pulling her deeper into irrelevance with each passing day. Each repeated pattern of waiting and hoping and gradually accepting less and less from the people she loved most. Outside, she could hear her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, talking excitedly to someone about the new community garden project they were starting in the vacant lot on Maple Street. The older woman's voice carried the enthusiasm of someone half her age, describing plans for raised beds and composting systems and educational workshops for local children. The city had finally approved it after 2 years of bureaucratic red tape, and volunteers were needed to help transform the space. Margaret had heard whispers about the project for months, watched the neighborhood association meetings from a distance, observed the growing excitement among residents who were tired of looking at the eyesore that had become a dumping ground for everything from broken appliances to fast food containers. Margaret had walked past that lot countless times during her increasingly frequent neighborhood walks, quarter-acre of weeds and discarded trash that had become an eyesore in their otherwise well-maintained neighborhood. She'd always thought it could be something beautiful, something meaningful, a gathering place where neighbors could connect over shared purpose rather than just complaints about property values and noise ordinances. But thinking and doing were two different things, and she'd perfected the art of thinking without acting, of imagining possibilities without taking the risks necessary to make them reality. Her phone remained silent, a small black rectangle that had become both her lifeline to the outside world and her primary source of disappointment. The silence felt louder somehow, more pointed, as if David's lack of response was a deliberate choice rather than simple busyness. She understood intellectually that he had his own life, his own priorities, his own legitimate reasons for not responding immediately to every maternal check-in. But understanding didn't make the silence hurt less, didn't fill the hours she spent crafting careful messages that struck just the right tone between interested and intrusive. The realization hit her like cold water. She was waiting for permission to live her own life, waiting for David to need her again, to call her, to validate her existence. She'd become a spectator in her own story, watching from the sidelines while everyone else played the game. But what if she stopped waiting? The thought was terrifying. and exhilarating in equal measure. What if she stopped defining herself by how much her son needed her and started asking what she needed? What if she channeled all that maternal energy, that fierce, protective love, that problem-solving determination into something else? The community garden idea wouldn't leave her alone. She found herself imagining rows of vegetables, families gathering to harvest their crops, children learning where food comes from, a place where neighbors became friends, where people invested in something bigger than themselves. Margaret picked up her phone, not to check for messages from David, but to research community gardens. Within an hour, she'd fallen down a rabbit hole of urban agriculture success stories, gardens that had transformed neighborhoods, brought communities together, provided fresh food to families who couldn't otherwise afford it. Gardens started by people who had decided to stop waiting for someone else to make change happen. By evening, she'd filled a notebook with ideas, sketches, and contact information for local gardening organizations. For the first time in months, she felt something stirring in her chest that wasn't loneliness or regret. It was possibility. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. Crazy busy week. Talk soon. 3 words. No response to her earlier message. No acknowledgement of her attempt to connect. Just a polite dismissal disguised as an update. Margaret stared at the message for a long moment, then set the phone aside without responding. For 28 years, she'd been available whenever he needed her. Maybe it was time to be unavailable, not out of spite but out of self. Maybe it was time to build a life so full and meaningful that his attention became a gift rather than a necessity. The next morning, Margaret Chen put on her good jeans and a clean sweater, tied her hair back with purpose rather than habit, and walked down Maple Street toward the vacant lot. Mrs. Rodriguez was there with 3 other neighbors, surveying the space with clipboards and measuring tapes. Margaret, Mrs. Rodriguez called out, waving her over. Perfect timing. We need someone with organizational skills to help coordinate this project. Are you interested? For a split second, Margaret felt the familiar urge to deflect, to say she wasn't qualified to make herself small. Then she looked at the weedy lot and saw potential. She thought about all the spreadsheets she'd organized, all the school fundraisers she'd coordinated, all the birthday parties she'd planned down to the last detail. She'd been training for this her whole life. Yes, she said, surprising herself. With the firmness in her voice, I'm very interested. As the group gathered around her, eager to hear her ideas, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The thrill of being needed not because she was someone's mother, but because she was herself. Margaret Chen, community organizer. Margaret Chen, problem solver. Margaret Chen, woman with her own dreams and the determination to make them reality. Her phone stayed silent in her pocket, but for the first time in months, she didn't notice. 3 weeks into the community garden project, Margaret's dining room table had transformed into mission control. Permits and soil test results competed for space with hand-drawn plot layouts and lists of potential volunteers, creating a paper landscape that reflected the complexity of turning vision into reality. She'd color-coded everything blue for completed tasks, yellow for in progress. Red for urgent and had developed a filing system that would have made her old project management colleagues proud, back when she'd had colleagues instead of just clients who sent her tax documents via email. The transformation of her dining room felt symbolic somehow, as if reclaiming this space from formal dinners that never happened. Any more represented her willingness to prioritize her own projects over maintaining appearances. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of activity that left Margaret energized rather than exhausted. She'd attended city council meetings, coordinated with environmental testing companies, organized volunteer schedules, and discovered muscles she'd forgotten she had from hauling wheelbarrows full of compost amendments. Her hands were perpetually dirty now, her fingernails stained with soil that she'd stopped trying to scrub away completely. There was something deeply satisfying about that evidence of physical labor, of building something tangible rather than organizing other people's abstract financial records. Mom, what is all this? David's voice startled her from her laptop, where she'd been researching grant opportunities. She turned to find him standing in her doorway, briefcase in hand, looking like he'd stepped out of a corporate catalog. When had her little boy started wearing ties that probably cost more than her grocery budget? David, I didn't hear you come in. She jumped up, instinctively moving to clear the table. Sorry about the mess, I was just working on something. He picked up a soil composition report, his brow furrowed. Since when are you interested in agriculture? There it was, that tone. Not dismissive exactly, but confused, like he was trying to place her in a category he understood. Successful marketing executive meets woman obsessed with dirt samples. It didn't compute in his world of quarterly reports and client presentations. Since 3 weeks ago, Margaret said, taking the report back and placing it carefully in her environmental studies folder, I'm organizing a community garden for the neighborhood. A garden. David set down his briefcase and loosened his tie. He'd stopped by after work, probably looking for dinner and familiar comfort. That's nice, Mom. Like a hobby. The word stung more than it should have. Hobby, as if her 20-hour days coordinating with city planners and environmental scientists were just a way to pass time until something more important came along. Like his next visit, it's not a hobby, David, it's a community development project. We're converting that vacant lot on Maple Street into a sustainable urban farm that will provide fresh produce to local families while creating green space and fostering neighborhood connections. She sounded like she was reading from a grant proposal because, in fact, she'd written that exact sentence in 3 different grant proposals that week. But saying it out loud, watching David's expression shift from polite interest to surprise, she realized how dramatically her vocabulary had changed. 3 weeks ago, she couldn't have told you the difference between nitrogen-fixing plants and soil pH levels. Now she was debating the merits of drip irrigation systems with master gardeners. That sounds ambitious. David sat down heavily in his childhood chair, the one she'd kept at the table, even though he never used it anymore. Are you sure you want to take on something so complicated? I mean, dealing with city bureaucracy, coordinating volunteers, managing budgets. You mean all the things I did when I was running your school fundraisers? Or coordinating the neighborhood watch program? Or managing our household budget for 28 years? The sharpness in her voice surprised them both. David blinked. I didn't mean it like that. I just meant ... This seems like a lot of work. For something that might not even happen, it's going to happen. Margaret pulled out her project timeline, printed on official letterhead she'd designed herself. We've got city approval, environmental clearance, and I've secured preliminary funding from 3 local businesses. The groundbreaking ceremony is scheduled for 6 weeks from Saturday. She watched David's face as he scanned the document. Really? Watched him, maybe for the first time in years. When had he become so skeptical, so quick to assume failure? Had she raised him to be cautious, or had success made him risk-averse? Groundbreaking ceremony? He looked up from the timeline. Mom, that's actually pretty impressive. How did you manage all this so quickly? There was genuine surprise in his voice, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Pride. Or just confusion that his quiet, predictable mother had suddenly become someone he didn't recognize? I called people. 1, researched regulations. I wrote proposals and attended city council meetings. I organized volunteer schedules and coordinated with local nurseries. She shrugged, trying to make it sound casual. Same skills, different application. But it wasn't the same, and they both knew it. For the first time in years, Margaret was the expert in the room. David couldn't fix this problem or optimize this process or give her advice based on his professional experience. He was watching his mother do something he couldn't do, something he'd never thought she was capable of. The city council meetings must have been brutal, he said, clearly trying to find familiar ground. All that political red tape, Margaret laughed, a sound that came easier these days. Actually, they were kind of exhilarating. Do you know what it's like to present a proposal and watch people's faces light up when they understand the potential? To have Councilwoman Torres say your idea could be a model for urban development across the city? She did know what that was like, because it had happened last Tuesday. She'd stood at that podium in her best blazer, looking out at a room full of elected officials and community leaders, and felt more alive than she had in decades. The teenage David would have been proud. This version of David looked vaguely uncomfortable, like she was speaking a language he didn't understand. That's great, Mom, really. He checked his phone, a gesture so automatic, she wondered if he even realized he was doing it. Listen, I can't stay for dinner tonight. Sarah and I have reservations at that new place downtown. Sarah, the girlfriend. He'd mentioned exactly 3 times in 6 months. Always in passing. Never with enough detail for Margaret to ask follow-up questions. She'd learned not to push for information about his personal life after he'd made it clear that her interest felt intrusive rather than caring. Of course I wasn't planning to cook anyway. She gestured toward her laptop. I have a conference call with a potential sponsor at 7. A conference call. David stood up, straightening his tie. You're really going all in on this garden thing? This garden thing had become her life's work in 3 weeks, but explaining that felt impossible. How could she tell him that she woke up every morning excited for the first time in years? That she'd discovered skills she didn't know she had? Developed relationships with people who valued her opinion? Found purpose that had nothing to do with being anyone's mother? I believe in it, she said simply. David kissed her cheek. Same perfunctory goodbye he'd been giving her since high school, and let himself out. Margaret listened to his car pull away. then looked back at her project materials spread across the table like evidence of a life she was building without him. Her phone rang. Dr. Martinez from the Urban Agriculture Extension Program, returning her call about composting workshops. "Margaret, I've been thinking about your community education component," Dr. Martinez said without preamble. "What you're proposing goes way beyond a typical neighborhood garden. This could be a legitimate model for urban food security." Margaret felt that familiar flutter of excitement mixed with imposter syndrome. 6 weeks ago, she'd never heard the term food security. Now she was discussing policy implications with professors and city planners. "I've been researching similar projects in Portland and Detroit," she said, pulling up her notes. "The economic impact data is really compelling." They talked for 40 minutes about soil remediation, volunteer management, and the potential for scaling the project to other neighborhoods. By the time Margaret hung up, she'd committed to presenting their preliminary findings at a regional conference on sustainable urban development. She stared at her reflection in the dark kitchen window. The woman looking back at her wore the same face, but everything else had changed. Her posture was straighter, her expression more focused. She'd started wearing earrings again, had gotten her hair trimmed, had bought new business cards at Read Margaret Chen, Community Development Coordinator. The house felt different too. Instead of echoing with absence, it hummed with activity. Her phone rang constantly with calls from volunteers, city officials, and local reporters who'd gotten wind of the project. The mailbox filled with information packets and soil amendment samples instead of just bills and promotional flyers. Margaret opened her laptop and began drafting tomorrow's volunteer newsletter. The mailing list had grown to over 200. People in 3 weeks: neighbors, local business owners, students from the community college, retirees looking for meaningful ways to spend their time. She'd become the hub of a network that spanned generations and backgrounds, all united by the shared vision of transforming one small corner of their city. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Dinner was great. Talk soon." Margaret typed back, "Glad you enjoyed it. The garden project was featured in the neighborhood newsletter today. I'll send you the link." She attached the article, which included a photo of her addressing the city council and a quote about grassroots leadership driving urban renewal. Then she set the phone aside and returned to her work. David didn't respond to the article, but she noticed he'd read it. For the first time, that felt like enough. She wasn't performing for his approval anymore. She was building something real, something that would exist long after he finally decided whether or not to be proud of her. Outside, Mrs. Rodriguez's dog barked at something in the darkness. In 6 weeks, that vacant lot would be full of raised beds and walking paths, with families harvesting vegetables and children learning to compost kitchen scraps. Margaret Chen would be the woman who made it happen. The thought didn't terrify her anymore. It thrilled her. The Denver Post photographer adjusted her light reflector one more time, squinting at Margaret through the viewfinder. "Can you lean forward? Just a bit. Perfect. Now tell me about this garden project while I shoot." Margaret knelt beside a raised bed full of sprouting lettuce, soiled dark under her fingernails, autumn sun warming her shoulders. 2 months ago, this had been a trashes-strewn vacant lot. Now it bustled with activity families tending their plots, teenagers from the high school environmental club building compost bins, elderly volunteers sharing decades of gardening wisdom with curious newcomers. "The Maple Street Community Garden isn't just about growing vegetables," Margaret said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd given this speech dozens of times. "It's about growing community. We've got families from 12 different countries working side by side, kids learning where food comes from, seniors sharing skills they thought nobody wanted to learn anymore." The photographer snapped away, capturing Margaret's animated gestures as she pointed out the rainwater collection system, the butterfly habitat, the little free library that someone had installed near the main entrance. Behind them, the sound of children's laughter mixed with the gentle hum of conversation in English, Spanish, Vietnamese, and Arabic. "How did a suburban bookkeeper become Denver's urban agriculture advocate?" the reporter asked, pen poised over her notebook. The question should have felt awkward. 3 months ago, Margaret would have deflected, minimized her role, insisted she was just one person among many. Now she considered it thoughtfully. "I think I always had these skills," she said finally. "I just needed the right project to apply. Them too, when you spend 28 years managing a household, coordinating schedules, solving problems on a budget, those are exactly the skills you need for community organizing." What she didn't say was how intoxicating it felt to be seen as an expert, to have people seek her opinion, to walk into rooms where she was expected rather than tolerated. The transformation hadn't been gradual, it had been seismic, as if she'd been sleepwalking for years and suddenly snapped awake. Her phone buzzed with a call from Channel 7 News. "The third media request this week. I need to take this," she told. the photographer who was already packing up her equipment. Margaret Chen speaking. Ms. Chen, this is Jake Morrison from Channel 7's Morning Show. We'd love to have you on tomorrow to discuss your community garden project and its impact on urban development policy. Urban development policy? 6 months ago, Margaret's biggest policy concern had been whether the city would fix the pothole on her street. Now she was being interviewed about zoning regulations and municipal land use strategies. I'd be happy to discuss the project, she said, pulling out her phone calendar. It was packed: solid city planning meetings, volunteer coordination, sessions, site visits from other communities wanting to replicate their model. I have a few minutes at 7:30 tomorrow morning. After hanging up, Margaret looked around the garden with fresh eyes. When had this become her domain? When had she become the person other people called when they wanted to make change happen in their neighborhoods? The answer came to her as she watched 80-year-old Sofia Rodriguez carefully transplant seedlings while her grandmother offered gentle guidance in rapid-fire Spanish. It had happened the first day Margaret chose to act, instead of wait, to create. Instead of observe, to lead instead of follow. Margaret. She turned to see Councilwoman Torres approaching with a man in an expensive suit and a woman with a media badge. Margaret, I'd like you to meet James Whitfield from the Denver Department of Community Development, and Lisa Park from Colorado Public Radio. They're here to discuss expanding the community garden model citywide. Margaret felt that familiar spike of excitement mixed with imposter syndrome. But the imposter syndrome was quieter now, drowned out by evidence of her competence. The thriving garden around them, the waiting list of families wanting plots, the 3 other neighborhoods that had requested her consultation, these were facts, not feelings. Ms. Chen, James Whitfield extended his hand. Your project has caught the attention of people all the way up to the mayor's office. We're looking at incorporating community gardens into the city's affordable housing development strategy. That's wonderful, Margaret said, meaning it. Community gardens work best when they're integrated into neighborhood planning from the beginning, rather than retrofitted into existing spaces. She watched Whitfield's eyebrows raise slightly. He'd expected to find a well-meaning amateur. Instead, he was talking to someone who'd spent the last 3 months studying urban planning principles and consulting with experts across the country. Exactly right, he said. We'd like to bring you in as a consultant on the pilot program. Paid position, of course. Paid consultant. Margaret had trouble processing the words. Not volunteer coordinator or helpful neighbor, but professional consultant. Someone whose expertise had monetary value. I'd need to review the scope of work, she heard herself saying, and discuss how the pilot program would interface with existing community organizations. The words came naturally now, the language of someone who'd learned to navigate bureaucracy and advocate for resources. Margaret remembered the woman who'd sat in her empty kitchen 6 months ago waiting for her son to text her back. That woman felt like a character from someone else's story. Her phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen. Excuse me, she told the group. I need to take this call. She stepped away from the bustling garden, pressing the phone to her ear. Hi, honey, Mom. David's voice sounded strange, tight with something she couldn't identify. I just saw you on the news. Which news? Margaret asked absently, watching a family of 4 work together to install a trellis for climbing beans. The Channel 9 Evening Report. There was a whole segment about your garden project. They called you a community leader driving grassroots. Urban renewal. There was silence on the line. Margaret could hear office sounds in the background, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, the white noise of corporate productivity. Mom, why didn't you tell me this was so big? The question caught her off guard. She'd told him multiple times. She'd sent him articles, invited him to the grand opening, mentioned the media coverage. But he'd been busy, distracted, treating her updates like amusing anecdotes from his mother's new hobby. I did tell you, she said gently. Remember when I sent you the newsletter article? And the photo from the city council meeting? Another pause. I thought it was just ... I don't. No, a neighborhood thing. It started as a neighborhood thing, Margaret acknowledged. But good ideas have a way of growing. Like her confidence, like her network, like her sense of purpose and professional identity and belief that she had something valuable to contribute to the world. They interviewed other people too, David continued. City officials, urban planning professors. They were all talking about how your project could be a model for other cities. That's the hope. Margaret watched Sofia Rodriguez run excitedly toward her grandmother, clutching a handful of cherry tomatoes. We're already consulting with communities in Boulder and Colorado Springs. Mom? David's voice cracked slightly. I had no idea. I mean, I knew you were working on this garden thing, but I didn't realize you'd become this person. Margaret smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. She'd become someone he didn't recognize, someone whose accomplishments existed independently of their relationship. For 28 years, her identity had been defined by her connection to him. Now she was Margaret Chen, urban agriculture advocate; Margaret Chen, community organizer; Margaret Chen, policy consultant. She was still his mother, but she was no longer only his mother. "I'm the same person I've always been," she said. "I just found the right outlet for my skills." "No, you're not the same." David's voice was quiet now, almost wondering. The woman they interviewed on TV, she was confident, articulate, like she belonged in those rooms with city officials and policy experts. "When did you become that person?" Margaret looked around the garden at the families working together. The teenagers learning about sustainable agriculture, the elderly volunteers sharing knowledge across language barriers, at the physical manifestation of an idea that had started in her head and become reality through her determination and skill. "I think I always was that person," she said. "I just needed the right stage to show it." That evening, Margaret's phone didn't stop ringing. Calls from other communities wanting to learn about their model, interview requests from podcasters and bloggers, invitations to speak at conferences and workshops. She'd become a minor celebrity in the urban agriculture world. Recognized by people who'd never heard of her 6 months ago, she thought about David, about the surprise in his voice when he realized his quiet, predictable mother had become someone worth interviewing on the evening news. For so many years, she'd waited for him to see her value. Now the whole city was seeing it, and his recognition felt like an afterthought rather than the validation she'd once desperately craved. Margaret opened her laptop and began preparing for tomorrow's television interview. She had statistics too. Memorize policy points to clarify, and a story to tell about how one woman's decision to stop waiting and start doing had transformed not just a vacant lot, but an entire approach to community development. Her son finally saw her worth, but more importantly, she saw it herself. The CNN studio lights were hotter than Margaret had expected, but she'd learned not to let discomfort show on camera. 6 months of media training had taught her to maintain eye contact, speak and project confidence even when discussing complex policy implications with national news anchors. We're back with Margaret Chen, the Denver community organizer whose grassroots garden project has become a national model for urban development. The anchor said, turning toward Margaret with practiced professionalism. "Your story has resonated with people across the country. What do you think it is about community gardens that captures the American imagination?" Margaret had answered variations of this question dozens of times over the past month, but she still felt a thrill every time someone asked for her expertise on national television. The woman who'd sat in her empty kitchen waiting for her son to call had never imagined she'd be explaining urban agriculture policy to millions of viewers. "I think people are hungry for connection," she said, the words flowing naturally after weeks of practice. "In our digital age, community gardens offer something tangible: the satisfaction of growing food with your hands, building relationships with neighbors, creating something beautiful in spaces that were forgotten. The Maple Street Garden succeeded because it met needs that people didn't even know they had." The anchor nodded thoughtfully. "Your project has now been replicated in over 50 cities across the country. How does it feel to know that your idea has had such far-reaching impact?" Margaret paused, considering the question seriously. How did it feel? 6 months ago, her biggest accomplishment was keeping her bookkeeping clients' records organized. Now, she was the keynote speaker at urban planning conferences, had a book deal with a major publisher, and served on the mayor's task force for sustainable development. "It feels surreal," she admitted, "but also inevitable in a way. When you create something that works, that meets real needs and brings people together, it has a natural momentum. My role was just to give it a starting point." After the interview, Margaret checked her phone while walking through the airport. 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, and over 100 new email notifications. The CNN appearance had generated another wave of interest in the community garden model, with interview requests from international media outlets and consulting offers from city governments as far away as Portland, Oregon and Portland, Maine. But the message that caught her attention was from David. "Watched you on CNN. Can we talk when you get back? I have something I want to say." Margaret stared at the text during her flight home, trying to decode its tone. Over the past 6 months, their relationship had shifted dramatically. She was no longer available for his impromptu visits, no longer sitting by the phone waiting for his calls. Her schedule was packed with meetings, speaking engagements, and site visits to other communities implementing her garden model. The tables had turned so completely that sometimes she felt disoriented by the reversal. David was now the one checking her availability, asking when she might have time to catch up. adjusting his schedule to accommodate her commitments. The change had forced them both to be more intentional about their connection. David now scheduled time with her like he would any other important appointment. And Margaret treated those scheduled conversations with the same professional courtesy she showed her consulting clients present, engaged but not desperately, grateful for his attention. It was healthier, but also strange. For 28 years, she'd been available whenever he needed her. Now he had to compete with city planners and journalists for her time, and she'd discovered that being pursued rather than pursuing felt both foreign and oddly satisfying. The airplane descended through Denver's late afternoon sky, the Rocky Mountains, creating a dramatic backdrop that never failed to take her breath away. From this height, she could see the patchwork of neighborhoods spreading out from downtown, including her own suburban enclave where the Maple Street Garden was thriving in ways she'd never dared imagine. The lot that had once been an eyesore was now a green oasis visible even from the air, surrounded by the geometric patterns of residential streets and commercial developments. Margaret's house felt different. When she walked through the front door, not empty anymore, but expectant. The dining room table that had once displayed family photos now served as her home office, covered with speaking engagement contracts, consulting agreements, and preliminary notes for her book about community-driven urban development. The walls displayed evidence of her transformation-framed articles about the garden project, photos from speaking engagements where she stood confidently at podiums addressing rooms full of professionals, and certificates. Recognizing her contributions to urban agriculture and community development, the changes weren't just professional. Margaret had finally redecorated David's childhood bedroom, transforming it from a shrine to their past relationship into a functional guest room that could accommodate the visiting researchers, journalists, and fellow community organizers who'd become regular fixtures in her life. She'd kept a few meaningful items: his high school graduation photo, the baseball mitt they'd played catch with for hours in the backyard. But the room now reflected the present rather than clinging to memories of what used to be. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 o'clock. David stood on her doorstep holding a bottle of wine and wearing an expression she couldn't quite read. Nervous, maybe, or uncertain. He looked older somehow, more serious, as if the months of watching his mother's transformation had forced him to examine his own assumptions about success, purpose, and what it meant to build a meaningful life. "Hi, Mom. Hi, honey. Come in." She led him to the living room, noting how he looked around like he was seeing the space for the first time. The walls now displayed framed articles about the garden project, photos from speaking engagements, and a certificate recognizing her as Colorado's Community Organizer of the Year. The coffee table held advance copies of her book, scheduled for publication in the spring, alongside policy briefs and correspondence from mayors of cities as far away as Seattle and Austin who wanted to implement similar programs. "Wine," she offered, taking the bottle he'd brought. It was an expensive vintage. She noticed the kind of thoughtful gift someone brings when they're trying to make a good impression rather than simply fulfilling an obligation. "Please." David sat on the edge of the couch, his usual easy confidence replaced by something more tentative. "Mom, I watched your CNN interview today. What did you think?" Margaret asked, settling into her chair with 2 glasses of red wine. She was genuinely curious about his opinion, but not desperate for his approval, a distinction that would have been impossible 6 months ago. The difference felt profound, a shift in the fundamental dynamics of their relationship that both acknowledged but neither had explicitly discussed. "I thought you were incredible," David said quietly. "Articulate, knowledgeable, confident. You belonged in that studio, talking about policy and urban development like you'd been doing it your whole life. When the anchor asked about scaling your model to other cities, you didn't just answer, you educated her, helped her understand concepts she clearly hadn't grasped before." Margaret smiled, remembering the moment he was referring to. The anchor had used the term urban renewal incorrectly, conflating it with the destructive practices of the 1960s, and Margaret had gently but firmly corrected her, explaining the difference between top-down development that displaced communities and bottom-up initiatives that strengthened them. 6 months ago, she wouldn't have had the knowledge or confidence to make that distinction. Now it felt natural, necessary, part of her responsibility as someone who'd become a voice in this field in some ways. "I have been," Margaret replied, swirling the wine in her glass. "I just didn't realize it until I found the right context to apply those skills. Organizing a household, managing conflicting schedules, solving problems with limited resources, building consensus among people with different priorities, those are all the same skills needed for community development. The scale was different, but the fundamentals were the same. That's what I wanted to talk to you about." David leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly around his wine glass. "Mom, I owe you an apology. A big one. Actually, several big ones." Margaret raised an eyebrow. but said nothing, giving him space to continue. She'd learned the power of silence in meetings and interviews, how waiting could encourage people to reveal more than they'd initially intended to share. For the past few years, I've been treating you like you were just my mom, not a person with your own dreams and capabilities and potential, but just this static figure who existed to support me when I needed it. David's voice cracked slightly, and Margaret could see the genuine remorse in his expression. I was so focused on my own success, my own busy life, that I couldn't see who you really were. I think I'd convinced myself that your life was fulfilled by my achievements, that being my mother was enough purpose for anyone. The words Margaret had wanted to hear for years hung in the air between them, but instead of the rush of validation she'd once expected, she felt something more complex: sadness for the time they'd lost, pride in the strength she'd found without his recognition, and hope for what their relationship could become now that they were both willing to see each other as complete human beings rather than roles in each other's stories. You weren't entirely wrong, she said gently, setting down her wine glass. For a long time, I was just your mom. I'd defined myself entirely through my relationship with you, and when you didn't need that constant support anymore, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. I'd spent so many years living vicariously through your accomplishments that I'd forgotten how to create my own. But you figured it out. David looked around the room at the evidence of her transformed life: the books, the articles, the speaking engagement schedules, the correspondence from officials and organizations around the country. You became this amazing person who's making real change in the world. You found your voice, your expertise, your own platform. And I almost missed it completely because I was too self-absorbed to pay attention. I became myself, Margaret corrected, her tone gentle but firm. The person I might have been all along if I'd had the courage to try sooner. The skills were always there, David, the intelligence, the organizational ability, the capacity for leadership. I just needed to believe. I deserved to use them for my own purposes rather than only in service of other people's goals. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of years of misunderstanding settling between them like dust finally allowed to rest. Outside, Margaret could hear the familiar sounds of evening in their neighborhood: dogs barking, children being called in for dinner, the distant hum of traffic on the main road. But these sounds felt different now, layered with the knowledge that she'd helped shape this community in ways that would outlast her individual presence in it. I'm proud of you, Mom, David said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Not just for what you've accomplished, but for who you've become. And I'm sorry it took seeing you on national television for me to really understand what an extraordinary person my mother is. I should have seen it years ago. I should have been supporting your dreams instead of taking your support for granted. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but they were different from the tears she'd shed 6 months ago while waiting for his text messages. These weren't tears of desperation or loneliness, but of recognition and possibility: grief for the years they'd spent misunderstanding each other, joy for the relationship they might build going forward, and profound satisfaction that his recognition had come after she'd learned to value herself rather than before. I'm proud of me too, she said, surprising herself with the honesty. For the first time in my life, I'm genuinely proud of who I am and what I've built. Not because someone else validates it, but because I know the work has value independent of anyone's opinion about it. The statement felt revolutionary even to her own ears. 6 months ago, her self-worth had been entirely dependent on external validation, particularly from David. Now she could acknowledge his pride and appreciation while knowing that her sense of accomplishment didn't depend on his recognition. She'd learned the difference between being valued by others and valuing herself, between seeking approval and earning respect, between hoping for purpose and creating meaning. Tell me about the book, David said, gesturing toward the manuscript. Pages scattered across her coffee table. What's it about? How did you get a publisher interested? It's called Growing Community: How One Garden Changed Everything, Margaret said, leaning forward with the enthusiasm that now characterized all her conversations about her work. Her eyes lit up as she spoke, and David could see the passion that had driven her transformation over the past 6 months. It's part memoir, part how-to guide for community organizing, part analysis of urban agriculture policy. My editor thinks it could really help other communities implement similar projects. Your editor, David repeated, shaking his head in amazement. 6 months ago, you were doing bookkeeping for small businesses. Now you have an editor and you're consulting with city governments across the country. How did this happen so fast? Margaret laughed, a sound that came easily these days. The publishing world moves quickly when there's genuine interest. After the CNN segment, I had 3 publishers contact me within a week. The advance was substantial enough that I was able to quit most of my bookkeeping clients and focus on the community development work full-time. It's terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. She pulled out her calendar, flipping through pages dense with appointments and commitments. Next month, I'm keynoting a conference in Portland, consulting with city officials in Austin about their public space initiatives, and filming a documentary about urban agriculture for PBS. The month after that, I'm traveling to Detroit to study their community garden networks. Then to Vancouver to present at an international sustainable development summit. David stared at the calendar, overwhelmed by the scope of his mother's suddenly international career. This is incredible, Mom. You've built something amazing. But can I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't been so distant? If I'd been more supportive from the beginning? More engaged with what you were doing? Margaret considered the question carefully, swirling the wine in her glass while she thought it was a fair question. One she'd asked herself during quiet moments between the whirlwind of activity that had become her daily life. Honestly, I don't think it would have worked the same way, she said finally. I needed to do this for myself, not for your approval. If you'd been enthusiastic from the start, I might have made it about making you proud instead of discovering what I was capable of. I might have sought your guidance instead of trusting my own instincts, or worse. I might have minimized my role to make sure I didn't outshine you or make you uncomfortable. She paused, watching David's expression as he processed her words. Your neglect forced me to stop waiting for validation and start creating value. Sometimes the best thing someone can do for you is stop rescuing you from your own potential. I had to learn to believe in myself before anyone else could believe in me. So my neglect was actually helpful? David asked with a rueful smile, but Margaret could see the genuine curiosity behind the question. Your neglect forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about how I'd been living my life, Margaret said. I'd been so focused on being indispensable to you that I'd made myself dispensable to everyone else, including myself. When you didn't need me anymore, I had two choices: fade into irrelevance or figure out who I was when I wasn't defined by someone else's needs. I chose the harder path, but it led to a much more fulfilling destination. They talked for nearly 3 hours, really talked, perhaps for the first time since David had been a teenager. He asked about her book deadline, her upcoming speaking engagements, her plans for expanding the community garden model internationally. Margaret found herself enjoying his company not because she was desperate for his attention, but because he was genuinely interested in her work and her perspective. The conversation felt balanced in a way their interactions hadn't for years, with both of them contributing insights and asking thoughtful questions rather than falling into their old patterns of maternal hovering and filial tolerance. I have a confession, David said as the evening wound down, checking his watch and seeming surprised by how much time had passed. Sarah and I have been talking about moving back to Denver. My company offered me a promotion that would let me work remotely, and we want to be closer to family. But honestly, part of the reason is that we want to be closer to what you're building here. That's wonderful, Margaret said, meaning it completely. The prospect of having David nearby felt different, now exciting rather than desperate. An opportunity for a richer relationship rather than a chance to return to old patterns of dependence. I'd love to spend more time with both of you. This house has felt more like a home since I started filling it with work I care about. But it would be even better with family nearby. The thing is, David continued, Sarah's really interested in urban agriculture. She has a master's degree in environmental science, and she's been following your work since the first news article came out. She'd love to get involved with the garden project if you'd be open to that. Not because she's my girlfriend, but because she genuinely believes in what you're doing and has skills that could contribute to the mission. Margaret felt a surge of excitement that had nothing to do with family dynamics and everything to do with gaining another passionate advocate for the cause she'd grown to love. The fact that Sarah was David's girlfriend was incidental to her expertise and enthusiasm, which was exactly how Margaret preferred to evaluate potential collaborators. I'd welcome her expertise, Margaret said, her professional instincts already engaged. We're always looking for people with environmental science backgrounds, especially as we expand into soil remediation and water conservation initiatives. The technical aspects of scaling urban agriculture require knowledge I don't have, and I've learned the importance of surrounding myself with people who complement my skills rather than duplicate them. She's going to be so excited, David said, pulling out his phone. Actually, would it be okay if I called her? She made me promise to ask if she could meet with you next week to discuss potential collaboration. Margaret laughed, a sound that came so easily now, bubbling up from a place of genuine contentment rather than forced cheerfulness. Of course. But David, you should know that if she joins the team, she'll be working with me as a colleague, not as your girlfriend who's doing a favor for your mother. I don't give special treatment, even to family. The work is too important for personal considerations to interfere with professional standards. I wouldn't expect you to, David said, and Margaret could hear genuine respect in his voice. Sarah wouldn't want that either. She wants to earn her place on merit, to contribute something meaningful rather than just being included because of our relationship. As David made the call, Margaret walked to her kitchen window and looked out at the neighborhood that had become so much more than just the place where she lived. Streetlights illuminated the sidewalks where she'd walked aimlessly for months, waiting for purpose to find her. Now those same streets buzzed with activity from families traveling to and from the community garden, neighbors who'd become friends through shared work and common goals. The transformation wasn't just about the physical space, it was about the relationships, the sense of collective ownership, the belief that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they decided to act rather than wait for someone else to solve their problems. Sarah says she can meet Thursday at 2, David called from the living room. She's already read your preliminary policy paper and has some ideas about expanding the composting program to include food waste from local restaurants. Perfect, Margaret called back, already mentally organizing the meeting. Tell her to bring her resume and any research she's done on municipal waste management. We're presenting to the City Council next month about integrating food waste collection with community composting sites, and her input could be invaluable. When David hung up the phone, he joined her at the window, both of them looking out at the quiet suburban street that had witnessed Margaret's transformation from invisible woman to community leader. Mom, can I ask you something else? Of course. Do you ever wonder what Dad would think of all this? David asked quietly. He always said you were the most capable person he knew, but I don't think even he imagined you'd become a nationally recognized expert in urban development. Been too afraid to pursue them. I think he would have been proud, but not surprised. He used to tell me I was wasting my talents on other people's problems when I could be solving bigger ones. He saw potential in me that I didn't see in myself. He was right, David said simply. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Colorado, community organizers and activists from across the country, all eager to learn from the woman who'd transformed a vacant lot into a national movement. The applause that greeted her introduction was warm and sustained, the kind of recognition that acknowledged both her expertise and the inspiring nature of her journey from suburban mother to national leader. When I started the Maple Street Community Garden 8 months ago, she began, leadership, community engagement, and my own capabilities. I certainly never imagined I'd be standing before you today, discussing urban development policy with some of the most innovative thinkers in the country. In the third row, David sat next to Sarah, both of them taking notes, like the engaged audience members they'd become. Sarah had joined the garden team 3 weeks earlier and had already proven herself to be exactly the kind of dedicated. Their working relationship had nothing to do with her connection to David and everything to do with shared passion for sustainable community development and complementary skills that made their collaboration more effective than either could have achieved alone. Margaret could see David's face clearly from the podium, and she was struck by the transformation in his expression. Gone was the polite tolerance she'd grown accustomed to when discussing her projects. Instead, she saw genuine engagement, pride that didn't feel condescending, and what looked like awe at the scope of what his mother had accomplished in such a short time. He was looking at her the way she'd once looked at him during his elementary school science fair presentations, with uncomplicated. The most important lesson I've learned, Margaret continued, is that expertise isn't something you're born with. It's something you develop through commitment, research, and the courage to act on your convictions. 8 months ago, I knew nothing about soil composition or municipal zoning laws, but I cared deeply about creating something meaningful in my community, and that care drove me to learn everything I needed to know to make my vision reality. The audience leaned forward, engaged by her message and inspired by her story. Margaret felt the familiar thrill of connecting with people who shared her vision, of speaking with authority about subjects she'd mastered through dedication and hard work. The woman who'd sat in her empty kitchen waiting for David's text messages felt like a character from someone else's story, a person she'd once been but could barely remember being. Community gardens succeed because they address fundamental human needs for connection, for purpose, for the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and useful with our own hands. But they also succeed because someone decides to stop waiting for permission and start making change happen. The Maple Street Garden succeeded not because I had special qualifications or unique resources, but because I was willing to take the first step, and then figure out the next one, and then the next one after that. After her speech, Margaret was surrounded by conference attendees wanting to discuss collaboration opportunities, interview requests, and consulting agreements. She moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who'd grown comfortable with attention, genuinely interested in each conversation while managing her time professionally. The networking felt natural now, part of her role as someone who'd Become a recognized voice in urban agriculture and community development. Mom. David appeared at her elbow during a brief lull between conversations. Sarah beside him holding a notebook filled with contact information from other attendees. You were incredible up there. I've never seen you so completely in your element. Margaret smiled, adjusting the conference badge that read Margaret Chen, keynote speaker in bold letters alongside the logos of the organizations that had sponsored her appearance. I am in my element. This is who I am now, who I think I was always meant to be once I found the courage to try. Fingers and wild stories. And I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. Heaven, Margaret had learned to value herself independent of anyone else's recognition, including David's. His pride was meaningful because their relationship was meaningful. But what means even more is that we're building something together now, a relationship based on mutual respect rather than obligation, shared interests rather than guilt, genuine curiosity about each other's lives rather than perfunctory check-ins. A conference organizer approached with another interview request. As she walked away to handle the next item on her packed schedule, Margaret caught her reflection in the conference center's glass walls. The woman looking back at her wore a tailored blazer, confident posture. Her calendar was packed with speaking engagements, consulting meetings, and site visits to communities implementing her garden model. Publishers were competing for her next book. Universities were offering visiting fellowships, and city governments were seeking her expertise on sustainable development initiatives. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. Dinner this weekend? Sarah and I want to hear about your book tour schedule and the documentary filming. Margaret typed back, Saturday works better than Sunday. I have a conference call with the mayor of Portland about their urban agriculture initiative. How about 6 p.m.? I'll cook, assuming I can find time to grocery shop between interviews. For the first time in their relationship, she was the one with the busy schedule, the demanding career, the important meetings that couldn't be rescheduled, and David was the one adjusting his plans to accommodate her availability. Margaret Chen was no longer waiting for her son to make time for her. She was building a life so full and meaningful that everyone else, including the son she'd once defined herself through, had to earn their place in it through genuine engagement, rather than mere proximity that evening. Tomorrow, while she was presenting to policymakers and urban planners, that lot would be bustling with families tending their winter crops. Languages. The garden would continue thriving whether she was there or not, sustained by the community of people who'd invested their own energy and expertise in its success. The garden would outlast her involvement, just as she now thrived independent of anyone else's attention or approval. She'd created something bigger than herself, something that would inspire similar projects for years to come, communities across the country that would transform their own forgotten spaces into sources of connection and growth. Margaret Chen had finally learned the difference between being needed and being valued, between waiting for recognition and earning respect, between hoping for purpose and creating meaning. Her son thought she didn't matter anymore until she made headlines. But the truth was simpler and more profound. She'd always mattered. She just finally believed it herself. The next morning, Margaret boarded her flight to Seattle with the confidence of someone who belonged in first-class seats in boardroom meetings. Her phone was full of interview requests, consulting offers, and speaking opportunities that would take her around the country sharing her expertise with communities ready to transform their own neglected spaces into catalysts for positive change. She thought about David probably sitting in his office building at that very moment, managing marketing campaigns and attending client meetings. Good, important work, but work that existed within systems other people had built. Margaret had learned the intoxicating satisfaction of building the system herself, of seeing an idea through from conception to national implementation, of becoming the person other people called when they wanted to make transformative change happen in their own communities. As the plane lifted off from Denver, Margaret looked down at the cities sprawling below her. Somewhere in that patchwork of neighborhoods, the Maple Street Garden was beginning another day of quiet revolution, families working together, children learning where food comes from, elderly volunteers sharing knowledge with eager newcomers, teenagers discovering that they could build something beautiful with their own hands. The physical garden was just the beginning. The real transformation was in the people who'd discovered their own capacity for leadership, creativity, and community building. Her son had finally recognized her worth, but that recognition had become a footnote in a much larger story. Margaret Chen, urban agriculture advocate. Margaret Chen, community development expert. Margaret Chen, author and consultant and keynote speaker. Margaret Chen, woman who stopped waiting for her life to begin and decided to make it extraordinary. The headlines had been just the beginning. Now came the real work of scaling her model, training other communities, writing the book that would help countless other people discover their own capacity for transformative leadership. Margaret Chen was no longer the invisible woman waiting for someone else to see her value. She was the woman other people looked to for guidance, inspiration, and proof that it's never too late to become the person you were always meant to be. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Margaret opened her laptop and began drafting her presentation for tomorrow's conference. She had researched to cite policies to explain and communities to inspire. Somewhere below, David was probably checking his phone, wondering when his newly famous mother would have time to call him back. The thought made her smile. For the first time in their relationship, she was the one too busy to immediately respond to his messages. Not because she was avoiding him, but because she was finally fully engaged in living her own remarkable life.